Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of 13 Reasons Why Season 1. In this video I'll give a full spoilers review of the first season of 13 Reasons Why. So if you have not seen 13 Reasons Why, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise things will be spoiled for you. However, if you haven't seen 13 Reasons Why, you can check out my quick review of Season 1 of 13 Reasons Why, which is spoiler free. There'll be a link in the description below. However, for the rest of this video, it will contain spoilers from the first season. So, for those of you who have checked out my quick review of 13 Reasons Why, you know that I love this show. I thought it was really great. I was really impressed with it. I watched it a second time for this review, and I liked it better on the second viewing than I thought I would. Maybe not better than when I first watched it, but with time passed, I thought, well, maybe the show, it wasn't quite as good as I remember it being. And I watched it again, and I was like, no, it is. In fact, watching it the second time, I actually picked up on a lot of new things. It was like a totally different experience. And that's my favorite kinds of shows and films. The things that you can, when you watch on the second viewing or repeat viewing, you pick up different things or get a different perspective on the show. And that actually worked here, and I was actually a bit surprised about that. So yeah, I absolutely love this show. I put it in my top 10 favorite shows of 2017. A bit iffy about the season 2 because I thought season 1 was pretty self-contained, but I don't know, we'll see. But anyway, yeah, I'm making this video in preparation of season 2, which from my perspective when I'm making this video comes out in a couple of weeks on Netflix, so I'm still a bit iffy about that, but I thought I'd go back and check out the show again in preparation for that. So I've seen a lot. This was like a huge sort of hit for Netflix, kind of like Stranger Things, but it had a much bigger blowback. There was a lot of, I actually have a friend who hated this show, and I know I've seen a lot of very negative hits on the show and the people who didn't like it, and of course there was a lot of controversy surrounding the show because it tackles a lot of controversial issues, and so there's a lot of different opinions that it wasn't handled in the best way. So for me personally, and I'm not going to get too much into my personal life, but this show is probably, and I mentioned this before, the teenage show or movie or anything that I identify with the most. For me, it felt the most real. It didn't feel like Hollywood producers saying, oh, let's make something for teenagers. Because a lot of the teenage shows and films I don't watch because they're very ooh, let's be all hip and cool and blah blah. And it seems like it's more like Hollywood telling teenagers what they should like rather than reflecting upon what the real teenage or high school experience actually is. And so the other film that comes to mind that this reminds me of is Pump Up the Volume with Christian Slater from 1990, which is one of my favorite high school things. Because the similarities that they have is that it focuses on the negatives, on how much high school sucks. And of course this film in particular is sort of updated for the modern era with the internet age and all that, and the cyberbullying, which is quite a common thing. And I think it takes a very really good approach to that, and it does it through the characters of Clay and of course Hannah, who had killed herself. Although something I think a lot of people lose sight of is this is Clay's show. He's sort of the main character when we see it through his eyes. So let me touch into the controversy now, because this is something I really highly disagree with, because apparently a lot of people tried to, were attacking this show. A lot of schools and counselors and psychologists are saying that this is damaging to teenagers who are suicidal, and they actually, they went as far where the show at the point they had to add a sort of warning at the start of the show when you watch it on Netflix. It wasn't there the first time I watched the show, but it's there now when I rewatch it, where they had this, the actors come out and be like, this is just a fiction, and if you're suffering through depression or suicidal thoughts, seek help. blah blah blah, and oh, maybe you shouldn't watch this. And see, that's the other thing, is that they were saying a lot of the high schoolers, like some high schools and other organizations, put out messages urging teenagers not to watch this, or especially if they had suicidal thoughts, because they thought it might, I guess the thing is that it promotes suicide. And I've seen a lot of like reviews and stuff where they're saying it's glamorizes suicide, is the way that I put it, but it makes it look appealing. I'm trying not to be rude here, because I know everyone has their different opinions, and I know there's been a lot of different controversies over different shows and stuff, and most of the controversies are from people who have not seen the shows. But I'm not going to make that assumption here. But yeah, I'm trying not to be rude, but I'll put it in terms of that perspective completely misses the point of the entire show. In fact, I am amazed if someone can watch this show and come off with the perspective that it promotes or glamorizes suicide in any way, shape, or form. Because I don't know, I'm just at a loss on how anyone could draw that conclusion. I think it is beyond clear that this show is not at all, in the slightest bit, saying suicide is a good thing. The whole message hits home, and that's why I personally love the show so much. How bad of a thing that suicide is. Because, as I said, your through character is not Hannah Baker, the girl who killed herself, although she does narrate or whatever. But your through character through the show is Clay. And the whole show is about seeing it through his eyes and how he was negatively affected by Hannah's death. So the whole point of the show makes you to feel sad and regret that she killed herself. In other words, wishing that she didn't kill herself. In other words, saying that suicide is a bad thing. So I really don't get this perspective that it's in any way glamorizing suicide. Now, I mean, the one thing I will allow is it has like this revenge fantasy element to it, because the whole point of the show is about Hannah making these tapes and saying, you're one of the reasons why I killed myself. And again, not to get too much into personal things, but when I was a teenager, I knew a lot of people were suicidal. I knew this guy who slit his wrist and paint the wall with his blood. He ended up surviving. I knew another guy who shot himself in the head, but he didn't do it properly, so he didn't die, but his eyes fell out and became blind for that. And of course, I had my own sort of dealings with suicide, which I'm not gonna get into in this video. But point is, part of the appeal of wanting to commit suicide is wanting to get revenge on those you think that wronged you, those that made you hurt. So it's like, particularly if you think it's someone who would be negatively affected, a loved one or whatever who you think wronged you, so you kind of killing yourself to get back at them, because you know they will be depressed and devastated by their death, and you want them to hurt. That is an element, not for everyone, but it certainly does exist. So there is that revenge element to it, and I could see how maybe some people who are suicidal might find that a bit appealing, and maybe so that's the only tiny thing I will grant you that kind of could seem like it's glamorizing suicide. But as I said, like, if you watch the whole entire show, in the end they decide that that's the main characters, Clay and Tony, decide that they shouldn't honor Hannah's wishes because Hannah was wrong for killing herself, and the tapes weren't necessarily the best way to go about it. Now, so again, ultimately, I say that it is not glamorizing. In fact, like, when I knew these people who were very suicidal, and when I was a teenager, and we sort of would have like shows and music that we'd like that kind of in our minds sort of glamorized like depression or suicide, like Nine Inch Nails and Marilyn Manson and stuff like that. And I'm telling you now, if we would not like this show this show would not be, or at least I would like it, but I wouldn't put it in that same category as like this Nine Inch Nails song talking about, shooting yourself with a gun or something like that. It's it's not at all glamorizing suicide, and I think people, I don't know, people just love to jump on the controversy train. This happens a lot, and of course people will point to there's actually been cases, copycat cases, where some kids watched the show and apparently like made tapes and killed themselves. So like, oh, it's inspiring kids to kill themselves. But that happens all the time with shows and films. There's guys go out and kill people because they watch Scream or Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Saw, and they try to emulate the horror shows they watch, or like Beavis and Butthead, where these idiot kids set fire to their own house because Beavis loves fire. I love the way that sort of Beavis and Butthead, the show, the creators dealt with that. This episode mocking, all these groups that try to blame TV shows for teenagers' behavior. I mean, dude, these teenagers obviously have problems to begin with, and they would exist and they would act out regardless of these shows. Just because they choose to emulate the show doesn't mean that the underlying problem isn't with them. And this is something I actually studied a lot, and I don't want to get too much into, but and I've read all the different sort of schools of thoughts from psychologists from both sides of the issue, and I think it's very ridiculous to blame TV shows and media for the behavior of kids. And I'm not just saying that as, it was dumb, but from a educated standpoint, not to sound too pretentious, that is the conclusion I came to, that many of these claims that the shows are responsible for this type of behavior are without merit. But then again, that's just my opinion. But so getting back to the show in particular, the thing is that there's a fine line to walk, and I think the show does a good job of walking it, of not glamorizing suicide, but at the other time not victim blaming. And to me, I would say this is actually a bigger problem, or at least an equal problem to glamorizing suicide, is victim blaming. And I think that's actually a lot more common. I've known a lot of people who I like and trust, who, in my opinion, whenever the topic of suicide comes up, they victim blame. Oh, it's their fault. They're not caring about their loved ones, or they put the blame entirely on them. They call them weak, and I've seen this. It was a very common opinion. So I'm sure if you don't have this opinion yourself, you've seen it around. They're weak. They're other whatever insults. And to me, I can't stand it. I think that is victim blaming, and I think that is entirely missing the point. And plus, I've heard the argument that suicide is selfish because it hurts the people around them. But to me, that statement is selfish, because that ignores the pain that the person is suffering through, and think that their loved ones are more important than someone who is basically living. It's like living a life of torture, if anyone who's ever experienced depression. So that kind of talk actually pisses me off more. And so I think when you have such a volatile subject like this, you have to walk a sort of fine line. You can't seem to be glamorizing it, but on the other hand, you can't seem to victim blame. And that's something I think the show does perfectly well, where it shows you her perspective and why she is not just a weak-willed or in the wrong for killing herself, that she was actually experiencing pain. And it's actually, and through the other different characters, it shows how they all failed to see that she was experiencing pain. Now, that doesn't make it their fault that she committed some suicide. And that's something that the show plays with nicely, because again, with the main through character Clay, he often blames himself and saying it's my fault because I didn't realize that she was in this pain. But that's something that people in real life who had loved ones who commit suicide do experience. There's questions they ask themselves. So I think it's natural for the show to do this, but the show doesn't really hit you over the head with, yes, it is totally their fault if it's totally your fault if someone else commits suicide, because this show definitely doesn't do that, because it also touches on their personal responsibility, but without victim blaming, saying that she was in the wrong to kill herself. That is clearly the ultimate conclusion that the show draws, and I'm amazed if anyone can watch the show and not realize that is the ultimate message here, that she shouldn't have killed herself. Because, the scene where Clay is crying and thinking about jumping off a cliff because he realized how much she was in pain and he misses her, what the audience is supposed to feel, at least what I felt, is regret over the fact that she killed herself and saying that was a stupid decision and wishing that she was still there. And the scene in the finale where you actually see her kill herself is very sad. It brought me to tears. I think it was very effective, and it's very effective because you don't want it to happen. It's a tragedy because she shouldn't have done it. But anyway, I'm just hammering over the same point. I think people either don't pay attention to the show, or just, too wrapped up in the controversy, or maybe too sensitive to this topic, which is fair enough because it is a really touchy subject, to actually analyze the show. And to me, the very apparent message that does in no way, shape, or form promote suicide, but more importantly, it doesn't victim blame either. And it talks about the importance of recognizing people who are suffering, and actually fixing the social environment, because it's all about the high school and the kind of that touches a lot on the volatile of environment and the way children are raised or treated, teenagers I should say, that could lead to these sort of people feeling completely hopeless and completely trapped. And that's something we need to pay attention to. We need to pay attention to the kind of social environments, and also people we know personally, if we see signs of this, to pay more attention and not just take it lightly, so that they do not kill themselves. And that is very clearly the ultimate message, just helping those in need who need help. And I think this show delivers that message much better than any other show or film that touches on the subject. Like, if you want, as much as I love the film Heathers, because that is a satire not meant to be taken seriously, but a more cynical view of that film could see that as promoting suicide, which again I would argue it isn't, but it's a lot more leaning towards that than something like this, which to me is very overtly a PSA against suicide, but also to help those who need help. So that's part of why I strongly disagree with those disclaimers they have at the start. Not just because I think they're unnecessary, but because I would say the opposite. I would say, if you're having suicidal thoughts, you shouldn't watch it. I would say, if you're having suicidal thoughts, you should watch it. And if you know anyone who is, or if you've dealt with this issue before, I think you should watch it. Although if it might be a bit too touchy of a subject for those that it affected greatly. But I don't know. I just think it handles the subject very well. Now, the thing is, I have a friend who doesn't like this show. Part of the reason she gave was because she thought that, that Hannah was an asshole to make these tapes and sort of blame people for her actions. But the thing is that the show is kind of saying that. It's not promoting what she's doing. It's not saying that it's a good thing that she's doing this. Oh, good on her for freaking blaming, making tapes and saying it's your fault you killed myself, or that I killed myself. It's not. In fact, if you watch it to the end, it makes it very clear that it's saying that she's not actually in the right for doing that. But the thing about the show is that it doesn't make judgments on that. It presents facts, and so that you can, and if your interpretation is that she's completely in the wrong, then you're not wrong. You're not off. And that doesn't mean it's a bad show, because the show's not pushing you into one direction or the other. And that's another thing about the show. I think it does absolutely amazingly well. Yeah. So anyway, Let me get more into the show, this fictional show, which it is proper. And I'm going to structure the rest of this review in terms of pros and cons. Because as much as I do like this show, and I just spend a lot of time talking about how powerful I think it is, it's not perfect, and I did have some issues with it, some things, some drawbacks that didn't quite work for me. So I want to start with those so I can end this on more of a positive note. Do a compliment sandwich, as they say. So let me start with the cons, things about this first season I didn't think quite worked. And the first thing is that the show would have been better if it was called 8 Reasons Why. Now, that's kind of a joke. I made the same joke about 24, about how that show would have been better if it was called 12. Point being is that there were too many episodes and the story seems to drag out a bit too long, and it would be better if it was more concise. It's kind of like the Marvel Netflix show problem. However, with the Marvel Netflix shows, the issue usually is it runs out of steam around episode 8 or 9, and the last 3 or 4 episodes are kind of unnecessary. Whereas here, it actually has a strong beginning and a very strong ending. It's the middle bit that it just seems to drag, and I've actually heard a lot of people say that, and maybe I think that's what perhaps turns off some people to it, because it has a very strong start with introducing you to the world of Hannah's suicide and the tapes and her backstory, which I think is very strong. And it starts to teeter off a little bit with the second and third episode, but then when we get to I guess it's second, third, and fourth, but then when we get to episode 5, 6, 7, and 8, I think those 4 episodes are kind of unnecessary and want to get, and there were a bit too many characters as well, because those episodes deal with Courtney, who I think is a completely useless character and didn't need to be in there at all. Also, Marcus, Zach, who I think work better as side characters, but their own particular backstories were pretty much unnecessary and sort of just beating the dead horse. And also Ryan, who is, I think, the most expendable character and the most useless and should have been cut out of the show entirely. For damn sure. Now, I do understand, towards the end of the season, they do end the show itself. Clay, outright states the structure of the Hannah's tapes and why she structured them the way, because it starts with her getting, called out and having this stigma attached to her, and then she just keeps getting beaten down more, and people like Zach and Ryan negatively destroyed her spirit. By the time we get to the later episodes, her spirit's sort of already destroyed. So it is a progression, but I still think this structure still didn't need those extra added steps, or that they could have been condensed maybe into one episode. Zach. Zach was an interesting character, so I don't think they should have written him off, and I'll get more into that in my positives. But his having all those episodes there was really unnecessary. And yeah, Courtney, if we're getting into characters, and I'll talk more about the characters on the positive side, how I thought they all really worked. Courtney is the one exception to that. Courtney was the one character I totally did not buy. I just didn't buy her motivation, her whole existence. I like the type of character where she's all bubbly and she's all officially, and she's really fake too, the way she interacts with people. And I do like that, and I have known people like that. But I think when you get more into her particular episode and her backstory about how she's, afraid, and basically she's afraid of being called out as coming out of the closet. She doesn't want to be found out, outed, as they say, that she's a lesbian. And I don't know, to me, even though it would be cliche and it would be the stereotypical thing to do, I still would have bought this a hell of a lot more if she came from a really strict conservative or Catholic family. I know that's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason, because it's actually very common. It's something people still deal with, and I think it would have been more poignant to have that. To have her be the daughter of 2 gay men, it just doesn't make any sense. I know they tried to address this in the show itself, and, one of the other characters, I think Alex or whoever, calls her out, or even Ryan, I can't remember, but calls her out. I was like, What? I don't understand. Yeah, you have two gay men as your fathers. Why are you so afraid of being outed? And she was like, oh, I see what they go through, and it's so people think it's typical because I'm the daughter of two men. That okay, I can see why maybe she would have a bit of trepidation, a bit of thoughts, but in the show, she goes hard out after Clay and after the tapes and after Hannah calling her a liar. She's like the one of the like most like ruthless among them who like wants these tapes to be destroyed. I just don't buy that she would be that hard out, so that much into now, that much against being outed in that situation. I can buy maybe a bit of trepidation. But again, as I said, even as cliche, if they made her parents like these strict Catholics or priests or something, then I'd totally buy it. And I think it would make a lot of sense. And sometimes the typical thing to do is the right thing to do, because it would have sold her character. As her character is, I just do not buy her. It just makes no sense. She has two gay fathers, but whatever. And this is the other thing that kind of was a drawback for this show to me is some of the plot, especially towards the beginning of the season, in the middle, where they have the other characters like Justin and Zach and Marcus and all these other who keep trying to sort of play at Clay and trying to get him to stop, and Clay's an issue, we have to do something about him. That was overplayed a bit. Like it would have been good in small doses, but they overdid it to the point where it's like, there came up like mustache twirling villains. It's like, we have to stop Clay, we have to do something about it. And sometimes they'd even use like cliches, and whenever they did to Clay's face, he'd always throw it back to him. It's like, really? Who talks like that? And I don't know, to me that almost seemed like the show calling out its own flaws, because to me that was a flaw. I did buy that Justin wouldn't want those tapes out, and I didn't buy Courtney or Ryan. And even, at one point Ryan even says, well, all I did is publish the poems. I don't see why I'm not that big in it, but why does he care in the first place? Why did all these other people we have to stop Clay? And like, again, I buy that they wouldn't want the tapes to be out, and they know that Clay would be the one who most likely would put them out, which I'll get more into in the positives. But I think they overdid it. Definitely, they definitely overdid it. Now, let me talk about, there's one episode in particular which I think was the weakest episode of the show, which I totally thought this episode sucked, and it should have went entirely, and that was episode 8, which was the one with Ryan. So it wasn't just the flashbacks because the whole character of Ryan, I think, and this is the homosexual guy who was writing poetry or whatever and published Hannah's poems. This is so unnecessary. Again, it's kind of just beating a dead horse. We know that it's very tacked on and doesn't need to be there. And the whole character doesn't need to be there at all. Like, so this whole backstory where she goes to, write poems and people, are reading her poem in public and she feels exposed. It's kind of just a repeat of all the other things that she's experienced. Now, I know, and this would probably be a good counter people have for a lot of things. I know this is actually reflecting in reality, because in reality, sometimes people do experience like repeats of the same things. But there's something, anyone who's taken the script writing class will be told that there's a difference between a fictional piece and reality. Reality doesn't translate perfectly to fiction. Like a lot of times amateur writers will be like, but this is how it happened in real life. That doesn't matter. Fiction is a totally different thing, and it has to be structured in a particular way to keep it interesting. And even if it's realistic, doesn't mean it's good fiction. And I think, or good storytelling for that matter, even if you're writing a nonfiction story. So this, even if it's like realistic in that sense, it still doesn't work. It's weak storytelling. It doesn't work. It's just repetitive storytelling. And on top of that, we get another plot of freaking Tony and Clay climbing the mountain, which that was so stupid. And they had this fake stakes where Clay is going to give up the tapes and Tony has to talk him back into it. That's so fake. Just listen to the tapes and get the fuck on with it. I just think they dragged this out way too long, and that episode sucked and didn't need to exist. But since I'm on the topic of Tony, this is another character I didn't quite buy. He didn't come off as quite realistic. He came off as a too stereotypical, wise mentor type who just spouts out, cryptic knowledge like Yoda or something, or Gandalf. And I love, and again, the show almost makes fun of itself because they have Clay at one point even point this out and be like, "Oh, you're an unhelpful Yoda." So it's kind of calling this out, which I don't give them a pass for. Even though they called it out, it still makes this character come off as, I just don't believe him. He does have a character journey at the end. I love how he realizes that he was in the wrong and shows that he has flaws, that he's fallible, that he's not perfect, as he was trying to come off. So towards the end of the show, they do a better job of humanizing him. But towards the middle and beginning, he's just didn't really buy him at all. So yeah, another issue I'm going to get with, and again, I'm getting back to the reality versus fiction. So we watch in episode 9, I believe, we get a scene with the story about sexual abuse starts to come in where Jessica was raped and Hannah witnessed it. And in episode 12, we actually see Bryce rape Hannah. Now, I know that in real life, especially a popular jock like Bryce, will often get away with sexual assault multiple times, and you've seen that in the news. Because if it goes unnoticed and you're a popular jack and they can get away with it, and people don't call them out for him, then they'll just do it again. So I guess that part of it was important to say, but I just felt as a story, again, this felt kind of repetitive, and also it felt it was unneeded. Because at this stage, even before that, it's what they did to poor Hannah. Because at that stage, I'd already bought that she'd kill herself. I would totally buy that she'd do before that rape. So I think maybe it was too much, but again, I guess they're trying to put out the message of the important, but it did feel like they were laying it on a bit thick. And especially since that's such a sensitive topic, sexual abuse, that I think having what they did with Jessica was enough to accomplish their goals without being a bit insensitive, I should say. And I think having it again maybe is crossing the line to being a bit insensitive, particularly those who suffer through these kind of assaults. So I can get kind of some of the blowback from that, because I think they overdid it with the second occurrence of that. And it's the other thing about Hannah, now this is kind of more of a positive, but the thing I disagree with the criticism is that I've seen some people say, I don't buy that she'd kill herself. I'm like, what? Huh? Because I think they overdid it. I think to the point where I think it's of course she's going to kill herself, or at least have thoughts of wanting to kill herself. I mean, they just batter and batter and batter her. And again, this actually does happen to teenagers in real life. So in a way, I think it's necessary, but that last touch I think was a bit too much, just my opinion. Anyway, usually don't like covering such controversial topics on my channel, but whatever. The show, this part of what I do like about the show is that it is unapologetic and just hits on all these raw issues which I think need to be hit on. And of course it's going to rub some people the wrong way, but I like that shows that take a risk and do it anyway. But anyway, let's get to some more negatives about the show, and I'll talk about this stupid fake out with Alex. Okay, so episode 12, at the end of episode 12, we see this show, Justin has a gun, who else? Tyler has a gun, And I think they show Alex with it. I can't remember if they show Alex with the gun, but definitely Justin and Tyler. And then we see Clay has gone out. He's riding his bike somewhere. His parents don't know where he is. And they even say, "Oh, where's Clay? Oh my God, he should be home. What if something happened to him? Something could happen." And then they show a teenager shot in an ambulance, and the ambulance is like, "Oh no, this kid's shot with a head wound." So it was very contrived, very obviously trying to get us, the audience, to think that Clay got shot, that either Tyler or Justin or Alex or whoever shot him, which is bullshit, because they knew that's not going to be the case. And of course, it's revealed at the end of the episode that it was Alex who shot himself, and that's who it was in the ambulance. And I think that fake out was totally unnecessary and very contrived. I did not care for it. Also, I think Alex's story is a bit underdeveloped. I read an article that thought that the show was more about Alex than it was about Hannah or Clay, which I totally disagree with. I think he was a bit underplayed. They kind of played up on how much he was affected. I did like that he was the different character in the group who actually was more sort of sympathetic to Hannah and realizing admitting their mistakes. And so I did buy that he himself would be a bit suicidal, especially this showed his home life, but it felt kind of underdeveloped. Like they could have spent more time with this, and it seemed like kind of unnecessary to the main story. Didn't really contribute much. And also I didn't like the foreshadowing of Tyler going on a shooting spree. I mean, this show is handling enough hot topics of high school, and I do think it does it really well. But I think adding full school shootings into it, which is an important topic that should be covered, but I think adding it into this story, which is already heavy with heavy topics, I think comes off as a bit contrived and a bit too much. So it has me a bit worried about season 2, that they will tack it on to it. So yeah, I wasn't a huge fan of that. And I'll get to this a bit more in my positives, but to me the show was at its height at episode 11, which was Clay's tape. To me that was the pinnacle, that was the achievement of the show. So the last 2 episodes after that weren't as good, as particularly the finale, which parts of it I like. I do really like that they wait till the finale to show Hannah's suicide. I thought that was very powerful, and seeing the courtroom stuff. But as I said, some of the other stuff in the finale, it just felt like kind of a lackluster way to end the season, to this very powerful season, and it sort of plateaued after Clay's tape. But that's just my opinion. Anyway, let me get into the positives, the pros, what I really liked about this show and why I like this show so much as I did. And let me start with the dynamic characters, because this is great writing. This is something the show does really well, and all these powerful statements and stuff that it wants to say would not come off as well if it wasn't for how well these characters, how well-rounded these characters are. Because, as I said with Hannah, this showed that she's not perfect, and you did make it very clear that she's not perfect. She is suffering, she is a victim, so they never victim blame her, but they showed that she herself has made mistakes, and she isn't perfect. And the thing with Clay as well, he's this really nice guy, he's the hero of the show, we identify them, but he himself is being insensitive to Hannah at times, and it shows how even kind people, even nice people can make mistakes. They did the same thing with Zach, because they made it clear that he wasn't just the stereotypical idiot jock, that he was actually kind-hearted, but again, he was being insensitive, but you can see their perspectives, and that's what I love about all the characters in the show, except for Courtney, who I think is completely flat, but anyway, I already talked about her. But the rest of the characters, are really dynamic, and none of them come off as two-dimensional, even villains or evil. Even Bryce, who's very clearly the villain of the show, and definitely someone who you want to see punished or thrown in jail who deserves to be for committing crimes. But even he's the kind of dynamic villain that most good shows that do villains right have, where you can still see his sort of perspective, that he's still, a nice guy at heart. He stops his friends from bullying other kids. Like, he's very against bullying. He only attacked Clay after Clay punched him, and when Clay was resigned not to punch him, he was like, "I'll show you respect." So and plus he really looked after Justin when Justin was going through his parent, abuse from his stepfather. So it shows that he's, a nice guy at heart, even though, well, kind of nice at heart, but even though he is ultimately a villain who does deserve to be in jail or worse, and you want to see bad things happen to, and whatever. So I like that dynamic. Also, speaking of Justin, again, he's like this asshole who mistreated Hannah, and doesn't use his asshole jock. But then you see his perspective. You see that he comes from an abusive home. And I love they take the time to flesh these characters out. And even Tyler. Like, Tyler's the biggest gray area because, he is a stalker, despicable. Nobody likes him. He goes around stalking people and taking pictures without their consent, and he might even it's implied he might even become a mass murderer and take a gun and kill people. So he's definitely, but even then you can see his side of it and how he's completely bullied, he's put down. I love that there's despicable characters like him who you think, oh, this guy's despicable, fuck him, one moment, and then the next moment you can sympathize with him and see he's being bullied, he's being treated like shit, and especially the way the others who were involved in the tapes who wanted to stop Clay, every time he wanted to get involved, they were really nasty to him. And you can say, oh, there's good reason, and there is. That's a good argument to be made, but you can also see the other side. Sometimes I felt sorry and sympathetic for him, and I love that dynamic. I love that nothing's two-dimensional. Everything's gray. And yeah, even like characters like Alex, he's did a lot of despicable things, but you could tell how much he regretted it. And Alex's father, I love to take the time to introduce all the parents of the different various characters. Alex's father was like this cop, but he wasn't like an asshole cop. You could tell he really loved his son and did care about him, but wasn't maybe necessarily listening to him and giving him the attention that he needed. So very fleshed out, very dynamic characters, I think, and that's something. If you know my channel, you know that's something that I love about shows. That's one thing I look for any show or film as really well-drawn characters. And I think that's perhaps the main reason why I love this show as much as I do. The main reason why I was attracted to it as much as I did. I think this is probably by far the best sort of teenage high school drama that does the best job at having these fully dynamic characters that don't come off as stereotypes or cliche or flat in any way, except for Courtney. But anyway, let me get in also to it was perfect setup. It was set up so perfectly. And this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier when I talked about how I picked up a lot of things on the second viewing. Even the second time I watched the show, it was fleshed out more to me. It's because it gives you more perspective, because watching the early episodes, knowing where it's going to go, where it goes, you understand a lot of, and I love it how they throw all this stuff in there, because the first time you watch it, you're obviously not going to get it or know what's going on. But they have references to, like, for example, Tyler or some of the other kids talking to Porter, and Porter was like, oh, I feel sorry for him, I understand. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sure you do. But watching the second time, you realize it's because they already listened to the tape, so they know that Porter that Hannah went to Porter and he failed her, and he didn't even report, and he's covering him up and lying about the fact that she went to him the day she committed suicide, saying, not outright that she was suicidal, but definitely that she was in crisis, and that he didn't really do that much to help her. And there's little hints throughout that sort of tie up to the people who have listened to the tapes. And it does make sense that a lot of the people like Justin and the others who were like, oh, we have to do something about Clay, because that came off as really cliche and dumb to me when I first watched it. after the first set of episodes, but then it made a lot more sense once you get to the end of the tape, because it realizes, because Hannah says in the tapes that Clay actually isn't a reason why she killed herself. That there's a different reason why she put him on the tapes. She put him on the tapes because she wanted him to hear everything she had to say. She wanted him to hear all the other stuff and to explain it, and that the fault was actually hers for not embracing him more. And so the others heard that, and so they could tell that instantly sets Clay apart from everyone else. It makes him the other. It makes him different. He's not the one with something to lose. He's actually the quote-unquote good guy who Hannah has nothing against. So he's more likely. That's what makes him more likely to... And plus the fact that he actually loved her. And he... Any blame is not being put on him by Hannah, even though he puts it on himself, but that's a totally different thing, so that instantly sets him apart and makes him a threat to the others, and because the others all have something to lose, but he doesn't. So I do love that, and once I knew that, watching it again, it actually makes a lot more sense, and a lot of other things that way. But since I'm on the topic of Clay's tape, a huge positive. As I said, I think that was the highlight of the show. To me, like, even watching that episode the second time, I was constantly crying throughout that. It really just hit me emotionally. Something like personally resonates about having that regret. And I love, and this is another thing, just a sidebar for a bit, that the show is so great at. It's playing at different perspectives. Like, for example, in the tape, Hannah said that Zach had thrown away the note that she wrote him, but we find out that Zach actually still has it, so that didn't happen. So, of course, some others, like Courtney, say, oh, well, that proves she's a liar. But it doesn't prove she's a liar. It just shows different perspectives and how different things could be different. Maybe that's what she thought she saw, and Zach even points this out. Maybe she thought she saw me do that, but I didn't actually do that. And that's actually a real life thing. A lot of things misinterpretations depending on one's own perspective. And I love the way they played with that in Clay's tape. How the tape is playing, how she's talking about Clay. It's like, oh, you were so confident, you know exactly what to say. And he's listening to it, and he's like, what the hell is she talking about? I was a freaking mess. I was so nervous, I was ready to shit myself. And I love that dynamic. And even like, Tony, and as much as I didn't like him earlier in the season, I think he really works in this episode, is there to point out that Clay has his truth, and Hannah has her truth. And so the tapes is her truth, so he doesn't know how, Clay's going to react when she hears her truth and how that compares to his truth. I would use the word perspective, but whatever. Same sort of dealio. So that was interesting. I really like that play on perspective there. But the whole thing, that whole episode was it was so powerful to me. Again, like, I totally bought the scene where Clay and Hannah were making out, and Hannah was just too sort of, she got this flashes about all the things that she suffered, and it was too much, and it sort of put a damper where she couldn't have intimate relations even with someone whom she liked, and so she pushed him away, because again, that is something very realistic. That is something I've seen before in people who have experienced like trauma, bullying, or something like that, that they can sort of reject people actually care about them. And that was played out so well, and Clay's reaction is perfect because he's developed very well as a character who has low self-esteem. He's not very popular. He doesn't have much confidence, and so from his perspective, when this happens, he sees it as something that he did wrong, or it's his fault, or that he can't do anything to help her, so he just walks out. And I love the retrospective of him realizing because he didn't know back then everything he knew now after listening to the tapes, realizing that she was suffering, and her reaction to him had less to do with him than it had to do with her. And that's something that he didn't realize, because that's again a very natural, very realistic thing, is that people typically in those moments will be selfish and ill, which is, I'm not saying as a derogatory term, but it's natural to have sort of think that the problem is them. Like Clay would think, this is my problem, I did something wrong, I'm not good enough. When in fact it didn't really have to do with him, it had to do with her. And I didn't like that she threw in that cliche, it's not you, it's me, in the tape. But it's basically, it applies there. It's just an overused cliche. That the issue was with what she was experiencing and not with him. And the way that played it out was so amazing. And it's just two moments in here that just brought me to tears. Was when we see Hannah's perspective when she's on the tape talking about how when she was with Clay, she was envisioning this perfect future, and you see her and Clay walk in the hallways and everything's great, and they, have kids together and whatnot. That was so devastating, especially for Clay to hear from his perspective after she'd killed himself, thinking of this possible future. And the other moment is when Clay has this sort of what-if scenario in his head, where he went back into the room and said what he should have said. Now, this is something, again, that's very realistic, very powerful, and I've never seen it done as well in fiction as it was here. Or perhaps La La Land did it really good in that movie's ending, but the rest of the movie sucked, so that doesn't count. But anyway, it was done so well here, where he was saying what he should have said to her, and it was so powerful. Like when they reconnect and they kiss, and then Hannah says, or not kiss, but they hug, and Hannah says, "Why didn't you say this to me while still alive?" That is one of the most powerful moments in fiction I've ever seen. It was just, it really got to me. It really worked so well. So to me, that was the crescendo. That was the peak of the show when it was really at its heights for me. But anyway, let me move on a bit. I want to talk about Sherry, because I didn't mention her when I was talking about all the other characters, because I wanted to have her own particular section, because to me this is a character who really stood out to me, because she was slowly introduced, because she wasn't really in the earlier episodes other than just the background. But we see her be very kind to Clay and go up to him, and eventually they actually make out. And the thing is I can't remember what I thought when I first watched it, but from Clay's perspective, she was doing this just to manipulate him, to get at the tapes. And I think that might have been what I thought when I first watched the episode. That, she's just being another asshole like Justin and Zach and the others and Marcus, who were trying to manipulate Clay so he can get rid of the tapes. But once you have seen the whole show, you really think that actually was not at all what she was doing. And I don't know how other people interpret this character, but the way I feel about it is that she was completely sincere, and she did sort of, that love she felt for him was sincere, and she really did, like when she made out with him, that was sincere. That's something that she really wanted. Now, and other people pointed this out, like Sky, when she saw Clay and Sherry together. Oh, she's a cheerleader, she's like the popular girl, and Clay's of course the quiet, socially awkward, nerdy guy. So in a normal situation, that would be how Sherry would look at him. She was, why? She would have no interest in it. But the thing I think is the huge change here is that she listened to the tapes, and so she already got Hannah's perspective on Clay, which from the tapes, she paints a very sort of rosy picture of Clay. And the thing is, as we're watching the show, we're getting both Hannah and Clay's perspective of Clay, and Clay's perspective is a lot more negative and shows more of the negative things that he did to her or should have done. So he's a lot harder on himself than Hannah is on him. But what you have to understand with Sherry, she didn't get that perspective. She only got Hannah's perspective, which is a hell of a lot more positive. So I think she actually fell in love with Clay from what she heard about him on the tapes, and that's why she was warming up to him, and that's why she generally she was afraid of what he would think of her after when he got to her tape, because, and I'll get to this shortly, of course he was good friends with Jeff, who died because of actions that she did or inactions that she did. And so she was terrified of what, and so she was trying to sort of influence his opinion on her. But I don't think it was to, like, it wasn't so she could get to the tapes or stop him from getting out the tapes like Jess and the others were thinking. I think it had more to do with she genuinely cared about what he thought of her. And this is something I do hope they touch on a lot more in season 2, and I do and she made a point, like, this to me, this was made very clear later, where she made a point to show him that she was looking after the old people who were in that accident, and she was trying to prove to him that she was a good person and that she deeply regretted what she did and all had regrets. And Clay kept saying to her, well, you should go to the police then and tell them about the stop sign. And she does, and I think it's because that she does care so much about Clay's opinion, and that he was able to talk her into it, because she made her realize that in order to be a good person, that she needed to fess up to what she did, the biggest mistake of her life. And that at that point she was still trying to, please don't let this ruin my life. But I still think she genuinely cares about Clay, and I think that was a really cool dynamic, and I do hope that they play up this more in season 2. Anyway, speaking of Jeff, this is something, when I was doing a bit of research on the internet, I saw some memes about, how dare they kill off Jeff Atkins? It's horrible what they did. There's like memes everywhere saying, can't believe what they did to Jeff Atkins. 13 reasons why it was good up until you get into episode 10. It's horrible. It's kind of like the whole justice for Barb thing in Stranger Things, but probably to a lesser degree, because that movement was just ridiculous. But it's kind of similar, where people were like, oh, how dare they kill Jeff off, and I don't think it applies the same, though, because Barb, they kind of just killed her off and forgot about her, which inspired them to overdo it in season 2. But with Jeff, I do think he got his due. In fact, I'm putting this in the positives, because I love the way they handle this character, because he's just, there's a lot of side characters who aren't really in the tapes, especially at the start of the show when you don't really know who's in the tapes yet. There's a lot of different side characters who blend in pretty perfectly. And then you see, and it took me a while to realize that I was only seeing him in flashbacks. And that was perfect. I love that, how they didn't highlight that he wasn't around in present time. So this is another thing that was actually set up for when I'm talking about the setup, because in an earlier episode you see the principal talk about Hannah's death and saying, oh, it's so tragic that we had 2 students die, 2 student deaths in such a couple of months. So you don't, that's just a throwaway line. You didn't think, well, who's the other death? And it's something they don't really touch on, but it's sort of just there. And later you find out that Jeff is the other death. And I thought it was played up perfectly, that you only see him in flashbacks, but they're not very overt about that until you get to this episode. You start to realize that something's coming to a head, and the way this is built up to is perfect. Because at first, I gotta be honest, I didn't really care about that Jeff guy. I thought he was a cool side character, but I wasn't like, oh, this guy's so awesome, how dare they kill him off. His death, I think, was the best thing about his character arc, or the best contribution to the story, I should say, because it's a great character arc for Sherry and a great character arc for Clay as well. And I love it's just amazing, like, how this reacted with Hannah, because when Hannah tried to tell him about, what she saw at the party and what she experienced after the party, Clay was he was hurt from Jeff's death and just being like, why you always have to make this about you? And of course that's something that Clay would later regret deeply once he realized the full scope, and saying that he should have been paying more attention to Hannah, who was obviously suffering. But you can kind of excuse him. And then of course the way that they dealt with it in the episode where he went to Jeff's parents and said, like, kept apologizing to him, and they were like, why are you apologizing? And he's like, because I was blaming Jeff. I was saying it was his fault for drinking and driving, but then come to realize it wasn't actually. He wasn't drunk. It's not his fault. I think that was very powerfully done. Yeah, and that's another thing. I already talked about how there's the thing about the victim blaming when it comes to suicide. And how there's a lot of people's perspective on that. Oh, they're selfish. I love how they even point that out. They have characters like that in this show. Like at one point during that communications class or whatever, when Hannah was having that one note, which they didn't realize was from her, but it was like, saying how depressed she was, and you have this other guy saying, oh, blah, 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 they just need to toughen up. It's just high school, blah, 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 get over yourself. I love that they had a character like this, because that's a lot of people's perspective, and I think this show is saying that no, that is actually a very black and white, a very naive, a very ignorant way to look at the very complex issues involved in high school life and bullying. And I also mentioned that I have to talk more about Hannah's suicide scene itself, which is another scene that had me in tears, because I didn't think it would be as effective, because this is the last episode. We already sat through 13 episodes. At the very first episode, we knew that she killed herself, so it's not new information. But actually seeing, and some people, I've heard the perspective that they thought it was a bit gratuitous or over the top. I can certainly see that perspective, but I totally don't agree. I think it was necessary because it showed her own perspective. It mainly showed her parents' perspective of what they went through. You totally understood them a lot more, and how defeated, not just the fact that they lost their daughter, but in the manner in which they did, coming home, finding her bleeding out in the tub. And it also, to me, it drives home. It makes it a hell of a lot less glamorized. Even though, I don't think the suicide was glamorized at all. But any glamorization, hint or hinge, that it may have had was completely lost in that scene. Because to me, that scene portrays the horrors of suicide and why it should not be done. And I thought it was and because you watch that scene, you're in tears, you're crying, because why did she kill herself? It's a tragedy. It's something to be avoided. Anyway, that is it for my review of 13 Reasons Why. Thank you so much for sticking to the somewhat heavy review. It's a pretty heavy show, so gotta be proportionate here. Anyway, my rating for 13 Reasons Why Season 1 out of 10 is a 9. Excellent, not quite a 10 because of some of those flaws I mentioned, with Courtney is being too long was the biggest flaw. Having a couple unnecessary characters, too many beats. It would have been better if it was called 8 Reasons Why. That being said, very few shows have such well written, such dynamic characters, and such powerful storytelling that tackle very touchy, very hot button, very important topics in a very meaningful and powerful way. To me, is one of the most effectively emotionally shows that I've seen in a very long time. As I said, I have a bit trepidation about Season 2 because the Season 1 seems very self-contained. But we'll give it a shot, and I'll be back here in a couple weeks after it's released to review that as well. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. Anyway, that's it for my review of 13 Reasons Why Season 1. You can check out my channel as I do review of many other TV shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Star Trek, Babylon 5, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.